Hey everyone, so today we're going to talk about cultural dimensions, and this is going to continue our thinking about the sociocultural level of analysis. So just to review, culture is the learned and shared behaviors of members of a particular society. And this can include everything from shared beliefs, attitudes, and values. But for ideas to be cultural, they should be shared with and to others. And then there's also an influence of the majority on culture. Um, and so not only does this majority culture or most of the people impact us, but by proxy, it is also influenced by our environmental context, right? So who are we around? What are we around? When are we around? Where, why, and how, right? It wouldn't make sense if you were living in the mountains as a culture to really value the beach and water sports, unless you had some huge lake around with big beaches. Those sorts of environmental contexts sort of influence the culture that we live in. Now, tied to this idea is what we're going to be talking about today, and that is the idea of cultural dimensions. And this underlies the idea of cultural cognition. So, cultural dimensions are the values held by people in a particular culture, but they are also a set of values or dimensions that underlie every single culture, or most cultures. And so these are, again, general factors underlying cross-cultural differences in values and behaviors. These have been identified sort of almost like universal behaviors that we see across the world, or universal themes that we see across the world. And within that, each dimension is a spectrum. And each country ends up becoming, or culture ends up becoming rated on a 1 to 100 scale on each dimension. And we'll talk about these different factors right now. So the 6 different cultural dimensions that were identified as values that impact human behavior and cognition, and this comes from a theorist known as Hofstede, and we're going to see one of his studies later on. But he identified, again, 6 different cultural dimensions. So the first one is individualism or collectivism, how much the society favors the individual versus favoring the group. The next one, uncertainty avoidance index, the degree that the culture has a tolerance for uncertainty. How much do they deal with ambiguousness versus having to be very, very specific? The one after that, power distance index, the differences in how people at high or low levels of power structure are treated. And this can also be in terms of the distance between the boss and the subordinate, right? How much can the subordinate talk to the boss or feel like they have the power to sort of question the judgment of a boss or to raise a concern with the boss? I would say in the United States, we have a very low power distance index compared to other countries because we tend to allow for greater discourse between the subordinate and the boss. The next one, masculinity or femininity, how much a culture emphasizes gender differences, how sort of alpha, so to speak, a culture is. The fifth one, short-term or long-term orientation, how much does the culture allow for delayed gratification versus immediate gratification? And delayed gratification would be long-term orientation, immediate gratification, short-term orientation. I would say the United States is probably more on the immediate gratification scale. And then the last one, number 6, indulgence or restraint. How much does this culture indulge or not indulge in fun and enjoyment? And most likely traditional societies would fit under the restraint category, right? Certain moral factors which may preclude you from joining in on certain fun activities that may be considered or deemed immoral. So one of the cultural dimensions we're going to talk about right now is this idea of individualism versus collectivism. And again, this is one of the cultural dimensions. So within individualistic cultures, people define their personality based on their own personal characteristics, their success, and their unique features. So the strongest values would be personal autonomy or independence, competitiveness, self-sufficiency. In collectivist cultures, identity is linked to the social group. So the strongest values in this one would be belonging to a group, which takes priority over what we need individually or our personal values. So in thinking about America, if you look at this picture as a cultural symbol of America in terms of the cowboy lives on his own, is sort of valued for bucking the rules of a society, sort of goes out there and takes care of business on his own or her own. And so all of these different things become cultural symbols of America and may point towards a more individualistic society for America. So in talking about individualistic versus collectivist cultures, we're going to talk about ASCH 1956. And we're going to bring this back up again from earlier in our sociocultural unit. So this is a very famous psychological experiment on conformity, which was trying to determine whether individual participants would conform to majority influence. And so what they did again, they took a target participant and put them in a room unknown to them with 6 different actors or confederates who were told to give the wrong answer to a problem where they were asked to compare one line to 3 different lines on the other side of the paper. And often they were told to give the wrong answer. And what they ended up finding was that in most cases, more than 1/3 of the participants agreed with the Confederates in 50% or more of the trials, even though the wrong answers they were given were very, very clear. And 3/4 of the participants conformed at least once. However, about 1/4 never conformed. And so some claim that they saw the lines the same way as the majority. Others conformed because of a fear of ridicule, and they thought that their perception of the lines must be inaccurate and the majority's accurate. So the conclusion was that even in unambiguous situations where the lines were clear, there was still pressure to conform to a unanimous majority. And ASCH concluded that some people's experience social influence and conform to avoid rejection. Now, they've done subsequent studies where they have looked at individualistic and collectivist cultures and found that in individualistic cultures, the amount of people who conform actually go down because group influence is not as great. But in collectivist cultures, the number of people who conform go way up. And so the replications of this in different cultures show that based on where your culture fits along these cultural dimensions, you may have a difference in terms of how you conform to other people. And so building off this, we're going to look at one replication of such a thing. So Berry and KATZ from 1967, the overall understanding was that collectivism is associated with higher conformity to group norms. And really, this is the same type of study. They just ran it through again as the ASCH study we looked at just a second ago. So they wanted to look at whether cultural differences in individualism versus collectivism affected conformity. So they took 2 different cultures. They studied the Temna people from Sierra Leone, and then they also looked at the Inuit people from northern Canada. And the Inuits were more individual, the Temna were more collectivist. So they again used the ASCH experiment, took them through it, and then the measure of conformity in this procedure is whether or not the participant will accept the suggestion of the majority and pick an incorrect response. So as a result, the Temna people had a significant tendency to accept the suggestion of the group and select the incorrect response. And then participants from the Inuit group were mostly unaffected by the suggestion of the majority. And so what researchers could conclude from this was that the individualistic Inuit participants conform less often than the collectivist Temna because conformity to group norms is ingrained as a cultural value, right? Pointing towards our cultural dimensions that we were talking about. And these depended on tight social relations, and so they conformed more and trusted more in the thoughts and feelings of the other people around them. The next type of cultural dimension we're going to look at here is power distance. And power distance index scores indicated that hierarchy between less and more powerful people is in place and rarely questioned. A lot of Asian countries tend to have a high power distance index because the thoughts and feelings and the rules and the decisions of those in power are very highly respected and rarely questioned, and that can lead to some good things and some very drastic changes and decisions. Lower PDI scores again indicate that the difference between authority and subordinates is not very different. So the last study we're going to look at here today is from MEEUWESEN et al. And this from 2009. And they wanted to investigate how cross-national differences in medical communication can be understood from Hofstede's cultural dimensions. So in the method and procedure for this, they wanted to look at patient-doctor communication sessions, which were videotaped and then analyzed against a checklist of criteria. And so they used a structured observation in this case. And then questionnaires were also used to gain greater information. They used 300 or so doctors and 5,800 or so patients from 10 European countries. That's a pretty big sample right there. So what they found was that large nations' PDI was associated with less unexpected information exchange and shorter amount of communication. So again, in those places where an authority figure is rarely questioned, there was a lot less unexpected information exchange. There was shorter amounts of communication. And it was more one-sided where the doctor was communicating to the patient rarely asked questions. However, countries with a low PDI had sessions that were longer, doctors shared more information, were more open to questions, generally more flexible in their communication style. So what you could conclude was that the ways in which doctors interacted with patients was very much cultural based on power distance index scores. And so in nations with a high PDI score, the role of the doctor and patient were more fixed. Protocol of the session happens closer to a script. And then understandings of the differences are important to avoid miscommunication and to more effectively spread information in a globalized society. You have to be able to understand the different countries that you are interacting with and communicating with. All right, if you have any questions at all over cultural dimensions, please, by all means, contact me. And if not, or if so, have a great day.